Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Samuels, Director of Alumni Programs for the University at Albany Alumni Association. Welcome to today's program. Before we get started, I did want to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. First, I did want to let you know we will be recording today's session. I will send out an email after the event over the next couple of days with a link in case you want to go back and reference anything. Also, we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the program, so around 12:45. So if you have questions for our speaker, please put those in the Q&A and not in the chat. We might miss them there. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gregor Wynnyczuk. Gregor is an HR consultant and communications coach. He designs integrated leadership development programs that include coaching for leaders on communication and influence. Gregor has a master's degree in English from UAlbany and a graduate certificate in organizational behavior from Harvard. So Gregor, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I'm really interested to hear the program.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm really honored to be able to be here. I'm getting okay, my echo's gone. Yeah, I've attended a few of these programs and I've seen a few of the videos. You've had so many great presenters, and just to level set expectations with everybody. As Melissa said, I'm a graduate of the University at Albany. The university was such an important part of my personal development and my transition into my career. But I am by no means an academic. The work I do is just very practical. In the industry, I'm very much of a practitioner of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. And I work with people hands-on to be able to apply some of these ideas in their careers and in their lives. So you're not going to get a lot of, academic references. I'm not going to talk about, citations or where these ideas came from. I've really, I think, honed this presentation down to be able to focus on some really good and useful takeaways for you. So with that, I'm going to put my shared screen on here. I'll be going back and forth from the presentation to just directly talking to you guys. But this presentation is really about the skill of communicating with senior leaders. And when we talk about senior leaders, we could be talking about your boss, we could be talking about the board of directors, CEO of your organization, and some other people kind of in that realm. So it's going to be different for each one of you. But what I'm really going to be focusing on is not just communicating with them, but really influencing them. And I think that's one of the key differences, and one of the things that's really important to think about is, if you're just communicating with somebody, if you're just sort of getting to know a senior leader, somebody else in your organization, it's not hard to build rapport with somebody, but to be able to influence somebody is another kind of skill set. And that's kind of really going to be the kind of focus of this conversation. So with that, I'm curious to know, for the folks who signed up and are here, who is it that you most want to influence? When you saw this program announced and you thought, oh yeah, communicating up, that's for me. Who are you thinking of when you're thinking of communicating up and thinking about influence? And Melissa, if you could put the first poll up and take a minute to think about, I prepared 3 answers, right? First is maybe your manager, some other senior leader in the organization, or senior leader outside of your organization. This is fun. I'm watching the results come in real time here. Other senior leaders in my organization seems to be taking the lead. Okay, so this is great. I have a pretty clear sense. About a quarter, maybe it's actually 29% said my manager, but well over 50% say that it's other senior leaders in your organization, which is really right on. That's the place we want to be. At least that's going to be the place that I'm speaking to, because so much of influence revolves around kind of understanding context and building relationships. I think for those of you who, and it's about 15%, said senior leaders outside your organization, I don't know the circumstances and your relationships with them, but if you're able to build relationships, then a lot of what we're talking about here might apply. But if it's a situation where you can't, you'll get some takeaways, but maybe not 100% of this will relate to that situation. So thanks, Melissa, for putting that poll up. You can close it, or I don't know if we can share the results. All right, I think I've just closed that. Okay. So here's the game plan for today. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is the organizational context that you work in. And I'm going to give you some tips and tools for better understanding what's happening in your organization. And then we're going to be talking about that senior leader. I've used the term your boss here, but like I said, I'm really talking about whoever that senior leader or senior leaders are that you want to connect with and that you want to influence. And then I think the real meat of this is going to be talking about you. What are your skills and what's your approach for being able to communicate and have influence with those individuals? After we talk about that, we're going to go into just some general communication considerations about communicating, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. Okay, so when we think about the organizational context, I use the analogy that your organization is a little bit like the soil in your garden. I don't know if people here are gardeners. I'm certainly not. But a few years ago, I tried to transform part of my backyard into a wildflower garden. And I cleared an area of lawn, and I got this wildflower, native wildflower seed that I got off the internet for wildflowers that are supposed to be indigenous to this area. And I spread the seeds out there. And the first year that they came up, I had like a dozen different beautiful flowers that grew in that area. It was really wonderful. The second year, they died off in the wintertime. They came back. The second year, I had maybe 4 or 5 different types of flowers. And then this past summer, I actually had a friend come over, and she was like, "Oh my God, you have the most amazing echinacea farm I've ever seen," because it was just echinacea. Like that's all that was growing, and the echinacea had really taken over. And I told my friend, I was like, yeah, I mean, echinacea is beautiful, and I guess it's great if I was able to harvest it and turn it into some kind of home remedy, but I really want a dozen different types of wildflower. And she said something really, really important to me, or really that stuck with me, was that the soil is going to tell you what it wants to grow, right? So when I planted all of those seeds, I sort of threw them into this environment that I didn't know what was going to happen. And what ended up happening was that soil had certain characteristics, right? And again, I'm not a gardener, I'm not a farmer, but there's certain levels of nitrogen, and there's certain balance of pH, and there's certain, is there clay, is there humus, but all of these things. But like that's for me a great analogy to kind of understand your organizational context. Your organization has characteristics, and certain people will thrive in your organization and other people will not. And it's not always a function of the skills and abilities of the individual. Oftentimes that really comes back to, well, what does the soil want to grow there? What thrives in that given culture? And what I would advise as a first step in becoming a better communicator and a better influencer in your organization is to really study your own culture, become a student of your organizational culture. And I'm sure if you work in an organization of some size, you probably have some kind of value statement or sometimes it's called the mission statement, but it's like what we stand for, what we value. And it'll be things like customer service and integrity and collaboration. And I'm sure as I'm saying these things, you're like, oh yeah, of course, that's consistent with what our value statements are. And these, put them up on posters, put them on your intranet, whatever, you see those. What I would challenge you to do is to document the real values, the real things that people value in your culture, so that you kind of begin to understand that soil a little bit better. And then the other thing I would recommend is to scan your organization or think about the people that thrive in that environment. Right? So there will be people that have been very successful, whether they're moving up the organization or they're able to really get things done or be influential. It's probably a result of their alignment with with what's happening in your culture. And then finally, you're going to need to adapt. This is something that personally, it took me a long time to recognize in my career. I started my career with this naive notion that I could really just kind of go in and just be myself and be successful. And we'll talk about kind of this idea of authenticity and being yourself and the importance of being known. But there's also a real importance to being adaptable and being the person that you need to be in the situation, which is the organization that you're in and in your job. And if you can't adapt or have tried to adapt and have not adapted to that culture, I would say then, that's something you might think about, trying to find another organization that is suited to who you are. I've definitely worked with a lot of managers who've been successful in other organizations and have kind of hit the wall or have been very frustrated when they've joined a new organization that has a much different culture and that they are unable to operate in the same way in that culture. So again, part of that could be just trying to find a new skill set, but sometimes it's just like square peg, round hole, got to find the right situation for yourself. Okay, so that's at a very high level, some of the considerations that I would recommend to think about when you look in the organizational context that you're working in. Let's talk a little bit about the boss or the senior leader in your organization. I'm just going to note some things that are true about senior leaders. First of all, they are responsible. They're in a situation where they have to negotiate a lot of competing priorities. They are very busy people. There's a lot on their plate. And as a result, they have a limited attention span. And I think I'll talk about that in a second, but they are in an environment, and I found this to be true in every organization that I've worked with, that the higher you get in the organization, the more political it becomes. We could talk a little bit about that term politics, because obviously it has a negative connotation, but what it really boils down to is that a lot of senior leaders have less unilateral authority than we think that they do. And I think this is a misconception that a lot of people have to come to terms with, especially as they're trying to progress in their careers, is that we think once you get to be the boss, you can call the shots. And that's not true, or certainly not as true as a lot of people think it is. Again, one of the things that I had to learn the hard way is, like, I can't just go into the boss's office and convince them to do the thing that I want to do, and they can just snap their fingers and make it happen. there might be a one-off situation where they do have the authority and they're just feeling like, okay, yeah, I'll make that happen. But usually you have to consider the political environment and the competing priorities that given senior leader has on them. And as I said before, they do have because of all the pressures that they have, they often have a very limited attention span. There's also something that needs to be noted too about senior leaders, or maybe someone who's your boss who isn't really at a senior level in the organization, but is what I call a working manager. So it used to be that managers managed, that was primarily what they did, is that they managed the work of others or sort of facilitated others to be able to get their work done. So often nowadays at this mid-level of management, I see managers that are managing the work of others and they are also doing the work themselves. So again, it requires a different skill set. It requires managers to be very nimble and be able to shift gears and put different hats on, to mix a few metaphors. But it gives them that limited attention span where there's just so much going on, where they've got priorities they got to get done. They got to negotiate between all these different people who want things from them. So managers, I think the key takeaway is are in a very stressful, kind of high stress or high pressure situation in a lot of organizations. So the two things as tools or as kind of ways to understand your given leader's position or where they're coming from and how to best connect with them. We're going to talk very briefly about leadership style and listening style. So there are assessments and there are sort of ways of really kind of diving into these in a little bit more of a scientific way. But what I'm going to offer up is some of the different leadership styles that you will encounter in the workplace or in anybody really in a leadership situation. And these kind of often work on a continuum. So the first way to sort of think about the leader that you're interacting with is to think about where they are on the continuum of directive versus accommodating, right? So directive leaders are the ones that are telling people what to do. Accommodating leaders are more conversational, are interacting and are kind of negotiating a little bit more and working with people in terms of getting tasks done and giving them direction. Another continuum to think about is how emotional versus rational are they in the way that they behave, but also in the way that they make decisions. Are they results focused? Which is to say they will do whatever it takes to get the result that they're after, or are they process driven, which is a style that really just focuses on following set processes, and sometimes people who are doing that kind of lose focus on what the actual result is that they're after. Are they action oriented or stable? So some leaders tend to want to do things. Others are a little bit more balanced in terms of their approach to taking action. And then finally, are they collaborative or are they independent? And this is I sometimes think of this as a thinking style where some leaders really depend on others to talk through and think through issues. Whereas other leaders they are, from a thinking standpoint, they're a little bit more closed off. They either keep their own counsel or they don't involve their subordinates or others that you're aware of, at least, into their thinking process. So they seem very independent in understanding issues and taking action. So that's, again, just some general things to think about as you're sort of trying to understand that person that you're trying to influence from the evidence that you're getting from the way that you've interacted with them in the past. The other key thing to think about, and this really applies to how you craft your communication and interact with them, is around their listening style. So there are a couple of key listening styles. And the first is, what's their area of interest? Some people, just based on their role or based on kind of how their brains are wired, are really focused on certain things. I had a situation a few years ago. I work in HR, and I've historically reported to, when I was in roles, reported to the vice president of human resources. And at one point in my organization, they left, and I was reporting to the chief financial officer. And that sometimes happens where, I don't know, for whatever reason, people think, oh, CFO, HR VP, yeah, they probably have a similar skill set, which they don't. But that was part of the problem that I got into when I was working with the CFO, is that I was talking about all the aspects of the leadership development programs that I was working on, and how we were selecting candidates and the things that we were going to be doing. And I quickly realized that she was less interested in the details of the program and what it was going to look and feel like than she was interested in how much it was going to cost. And I learned in my relationship with her that, like, the key thing that she was listening for in any conversation was cost. Like, that was her area of interest at the detriment of almost everything else. People also kind of listen through this lens of personal value, or you may have heard the acronym what's in, or WIFM, what's in it for me. So that's another thing that people think about, is like, if you're trying to pitch them an idea or talk about some issue, if it doesn't have any kind of, it doesn't matter to them, it doesn't impact them, they may not kind of be as interested or may not listen as closely. A similar thing is constituent value. So there are people who feel that they are representing, or are formally tasked with representing, another group of people. So sometimes people really just listen for, like, well, what about my people? What about my team? What about, I'm in sales, what about my customers, right? So that they're really only going to be thinking, or one of the things that they're primarily going to be thinking about when they listen to what you have to say is, are you connecting anything with their constituents? There is an aspect of communication, and these, by the way, are not mutually exclusive, that people can have, a combination of any number of these at the same time. But logistics is another thing that I think is important to think about as you're communicating. And when people think about logistics, there are two pieces of that. It's the logistics of the conversation itself. So if you walk into your boss's office and you say, hey, do you have a minute? I want to talk about XYZ. Part of the logistics of that is they're going to be thinking, well, I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Like, is this going to take more than 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes? Who else needs to be part of this meeting? Should I have prepared anything? Is there anything? So I think that's something that, if we keep in mind as we communicate, what are the logistical needs of the listener, that can really help us be better prepared. But logistics also involves the details of your idea, or of the thing that you're communicating. And this relates to level of focus. So there are people who are very detail oriented, and when they listen to your ideas or your communication, will sort of begin to pick it apart, be like, yeah, but have you thought about, how the user acceptance testing is going to work, and if we're going to be able to get staff to do that, and then sort of pick apart things in a very detailed way. Generally speaking, the higher people are in your organization, the higher their level of focus are. This is general, not always true, but generally true, that they're going to have a different vantage point, and they're going to be thinking about the issue that you're talking about within a much larger context. And you may not know, and certainly won't know the details of what that context exactly is. So with that, you really need to understand what that individual's priorities are. And I'm going to ask Melissa to actually put up our next survey question, because I'm curious to know if you are clear about the priorities of that individual that you're thinking about influencing, that senior leader or your boss. Do you feel that you really understand their priorities? So Melissa, if you could put the survey up, I'd just be curious. It's a quick yes, no poll. Let's see, well, that poll went away. All right, so assuming you don't know, and for some reason the survey is not coming up, so we're just going to keep moving. If you don't know what their priorities are, I would simply say ask. And asking, don't directly say like, what are your priorities? But probe with a very thoughtful question, like, how do you envision our area evolving? And again, this is specific to a team setting, but our area evolving in the next few years. What's the most important strategic priority right now? What changes would make the biggest difference for our team? Questions like that can help draw out the thinking of that senior leader that you're trying to influence, and give you insight into what matters to them, but also the organizational context that they are faced with in terms of the decisions that they need to make and the pressures and priorities that they face. Okay, so again, that's very high level, some things to think about to talk to when you're considering that individual that you're trying to influence. The next piece that I want to talk about is you, right? So how aware of your own skills and abilities and your own personality and how you come across are you? And obviously this self-awareness is one component of emotional intelligence. And self-awareness is really kind of the first key and the first building block in being able to build and improve on your emotional intelligence. And there are two pieces to self-awareness: an internal self-awareness and an external self-awareness. So internal self-awareness is really, are you aware, or how good are you at monitoring your emotional state, what you're feeling and how your body and what's kind of happening inside you. And then not just kind of from an emotional standpoint, are you really clear about what you value, what your personal priorities are? And all of these things add up really to be an internal compass. So that when we make decisions, that we are clear about why this is the right decision for us. And this is obviously something that can be known by other people, that if we have a kind of consistency about where we're coming from and the things that matter to us and that we stand for, that kind of is a really great trait for yourself and for your career. The external part of self-awareness really is simply an understanding and an awareness of how others see us, the impact that we have on others. And this is distinct from self-consciousness, which can be very limiting, where we think, oh my God, everybody's looking at us. Is my, do I have a hair out of place? Am I looking, is my shirt untucked or whatever? But it's like really to be able to clearly understand without bias what the impact that we're having in a given situation and on other people are. So there are a lot of challenges associated with self-awareness, and that bias is one of them. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term confirmation bias, but confirmation bias is basically a sort of flaw of thinking where we tend to look for information that reaffirms things that we already believe. So if you already believe that people, wherever you go, everybody loves you, then you're going to look for information that reaffirms that belief. If you believe on the flip side, like that nobody likes you, everybody hates you, and everything you do is wrong, well, you will tend to look for information that reaffirms that bias. I know those are very kind of extreme examples, but that's kind of how confirmation bias works. And the truth is that we default to confirmation bias because honest feedback is really hard to get. It's really important, but it's really hard to get because we don't often tell each other the truth about what we're thinking about each other, about other people. So there are methods, again, surveys and different things that in a structured kind of development environment that we can use to give people that kind of feedback. But even still, having the feedback is the first challenge, and then accepting it as true and internalizing it and realizing like, oh wow, I have to challenge this assumption that I've had about myself is kind of the next level. But I think this is an area that we all can stand to improve in. This is truly something that everybody in the world, there's a divergence between who we think we are and how we're perceived by others. Maybe that divergence is a little, and sometimes it's a lot, but that's an area that we can all kind of use improvement in. And unfortunately, I have found that as people's status changes, their perceptions of themselves change. So as people move up in an organization and get more power, they become a little bit isolated and a little bit more quick to default that they're doing great, even in the face of evidence that points to the contrary. It's something that I've heard called CEO's disease, which is something that occurs when you're in an executive position and you either intentionally or so often unintentionally shut down those avenues of feedback. And because you have that positional authority, nobody's going to challenge you. And you're going to live in this bubble where you think you're doing great. And most people are going to tell you that you're doing great because of your positional authority, because they report to you, they depend on you, they want to stay in your good graces. And they're going to make you think that you're doing fantastic when, oftentimes the reality is much different. So that, I think, as somebody who is interested in communicating with the senior level individual, also recognize that CEO disease. If you see it, there's not going to be much you can do about it, but recognize that people are in that situation where they are a little bit more disconnected from how they're really coming across. So when we think about this idea of self-awareness, for me, one of the key questions is what drives you or what motivates you. And like I said, I've been doing leadership development programs for a really long time, and I work with a lot of high potential individuals, and I'm oftentimes really kind of shocked at how few people really understand what their motivation is. So like I said, in these programs, invariably, I'm working with ambitious, driven, smart people, but very few really understand why they are ambitious, why they want to be a manager, why they want to be a senior leader. Oftentimes, there's any host of reasons from, they want to make more money, they want to have more power. But a lot of times people just feel like, well, that's what everybody does, or that's what I was told I was supposed to do, or they kind of inherit this understanding. So one of the key things that I work with people is doing is really kind of drilling down and really understanding, getting back to that internal compass piece, like really what drives them and what motivates them to do what they do. Okay, so again, there's a very high level context. for understanding yourself and understanding what you bring or how you can improve what you have to offer in your organization. So what I want to transition to now is talk about some really general communication considerations. And the first thing I want you to keep in mind is that everything communicates. And when you think about who you are and who you are being, the key takeaway here is to recognize that who you are being matters. So before you even open your mouth, people are making judgments about you. It sounds harsh, but it's what we do as human beings. And as you can tell, I'm a big fan of stock photography. So I dropped in a picture of a woman here. And as soon as her face came on the screen, you looked at her, and because we're human beings, we evaluated her and we made judgments about her. And we don't even know who she is, what her name is, what her job is, why we're looking at her, but we make judgments. That's what we do. And I don't want to say that in a way that should be like, oh my God, I have to try to control every aspect of my appearance. In fact, I would sort of just make sure you're aware of, again, around this idea of self-awareness, aware of how you are coming across, but also being authentically you is something that can come across powerfully and can come across in a way that will sort of negate the importance of being sort of perfect or who you think you should be. And this is, I think, one of the challenges with this kind of executive level or senior leader communication is that we know that we need to be a certain way when we communicate with senior leaders, but we're not sure. So we tend to kind of stiffen up and be like, okay, I want to be, I want to come across, but what comes across is the stiffness and the trying and the not being yourself. So again, I'm going to talk about that idea of authenticity in just a second. But one of the key takeaways, and this is a skill that everybody needs to develop to improve their communications, is to make it easy for your listener to understand what you're saying. And this, I think, goes for all communication, but particularly for executive communication, where you're not going to get a lot of time in front of a senior leader. You really need to maximize the use of that time. And so much of that has to be your ability to say a lot, to take everything that you know and everything that you want to share and boil it down into a really concise message. For what it's worth, I've worked in a lot of technical organizations with a lot of incredibly smart people. And I've also noticed that there's a connection between your degree and how good you are able to communicate in a way that makes it easier for your listener, which is to say, if you've got a PhD, you're going to struggle, or at least I've seen people struggle much harder to just encapsulate that one idea as opposed to go on and on about trying to share everything that they know on the topic. So make it easy for your listener to understand you. If you can say what you've written out in a page in one paragraph, say it in a paragraph. If you can say what's in a paragraph in a sentence, say it in a sentence. So not only do you want to make it easier for yourself to be understood by them, you want to make it easy for them to take action. So early in my career, somebody gave me the advice. There's a boss that I worked for, was like, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, right? So this is a management cliche that you may have heard. And it's not bad. I'm not saying that's a terrible idea, but I would build on that to take it to the next level and say, do not just not bring problems and bring solutions, but make sure that those solutions are as easy as possible for that individual to implement, right? So you could identify a problem and say, you know what the problem is that we need to change our software development process so that it, incorporates this, this new system. Well, your boss may not be in a position to actually make that change. And depending on the nature of your organization, like that change may just be a non-starter, right? So what I would recommend is you think about not just things that would be great if they happened, but try to tailor those recommendations to say, well, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution. And by the way, I've already filled out the purchase order for you to buy the software that will enable us to, address that issue. And I've already talked to IT and they're ready to do the upgrade so that we can use this tool, right? So that's a real next level of identifying solutions and making it easier for that decision maker to go, you know what, you've really thought this through, and without kind of dumping it in their lap, if you will. The next thing that I would say that you need to keep in mind with your communications, particularly around influence, is to focus on the long term. Again, one of the misconceptions I had early in my career, I was able to get in to talk to the CEO of the very first organization that I worked with, and pitched them on an idea for a new kind of internal communication program. And I thought that I would be able to walk into their office, wave my hands around, do my pitch, give them the thing, and get the thumbs up. And very few decisions, and no significant change initiative works that way, right? It's a process. It will often involve not only sort of pitching the individual, but doing the research to talk to others to understand what the other implications are, who that senior leader is going to talk to about it, having conversations with everybody who's kind of impacted by whatever change you're talking about, but also recognizing that the senior leader, as I said, they've got a lot of things going on. They may want to think about it. It may not really matter that much to them. So you may have to continue to advocate for it and sort of show the cost of not taking action and really making it a project as opposed to a one and done, walk in there, get the yes and make it happen. This is another thing that I think applies to senior leaders, but also applies to all good communication, is to ask good questions. So, the thing about questions is that questions frame thinking. And a thoughtful question not only sort of frames the conversation, but shows your thinking and interest in really moving the conversation forward. So we talked before about those questions to get that senior leader to reveal what their kind of priorities are and what their thinking is. But asking good questions around the pitch process or in your communications with them, particularly when things start to go in a direction during that conversation where you didn't plan for it to go. The default that I recommend for a lot of people is to get curious. So to ask those questions about, well, tell me more about why you think that this is not a priority or why we should not go in this direction. And then finally, to being known is a really, really key piece. And again, this is one of those things that I think applies to people in a organizational environment where they're working with others. I was brought in, this is pre-pandemic, to coach a kind of a mid-level IT manager. And I was able to go in and meet with them in their office. And I went into their office and there was nothing on the walls. There was nothing on their desk except their laptop, and they keep it, and I walked in and I was like, did you did you just get relocated here? And they're like, no, this is my office. You know, they didn't understand even why I was asking the question. This person had been working for the same organization for years, yet had a very clear distinction between what they considered their personal life and their personality, their self, and their work life. So they were incredibly structured. They were really very like business only, and they were incredibly competent. Like this individual was so good at their job, but part of the struggle for them was like, well, why am I not getting promoted? And the answer was because nobody knows who you are. Like you're not revealing anything about yourself. And that turned out to be a really interesting process to work with them to be more known, because we trust people that we know. And if people are, withholding significant parts of their personality, we don't feel like we know them. It's like, oh God, yeah, they're smart, but we want as human beings to have that connection. And again, I think this is something so important when we think about that executive level communication, because so many of us, our initial instinct is to try to be more executive, which often looks like, sort of shutting down, being overly professional, putting on clothes that you don't normally wear, and then you come across as uncomfortable in your own skin. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing and stop talking, because I know that we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Yes, we do.
All right.
I had a few folks post questions, and then I had a few questions actually sent to me earlier. So let's get started. Marlene would like to know, do you find that visual aids assist with communicating with senior leaders?
Yes. Yeah. Particularly kind of infographic style visual aids that can capture, financial information, data, things that are really well represented, are really, really very useful. As you can see from my presentation, I tend to use a lot of pictures, which are very visual, but I think are great for presentations like this. But I don't know, it really depends on your audience. I don't know that they would resonate in the same way with senior leaders as good kind of infographic visuals, but yeah, definitely.
Great. All right, Lee would like to know, should you come up with a quick elevator speech?
Yeah, so for me, that relates to the idea of being able to communicate your idea or the thing that you're trying to pitch or influence for, or agitate for, at a number of different levels. Be able to talk about it at length, but be able to summarize it. And I love the idea. Yeah, I mean, that's a very common idea, the elevator speech, where you walked into the elevator, there's the CEO or that senior leader, and you've got 30 seconds. Knowing what to say, and even having written it out, having rehearsed it, is always a really good idea. Great.
Tiana would like to know if you can recommend a tool to determine one's own leadership style. So are there tools out there that folks can use?
Not specific to leadership style. There are other components of emotional intelligence, 360 tools that I use. There's DISC, there's MBTI, but there's nothing specific that I found that really speaks to kind of those elements of leadership style that I shared. I don't have a good survey for that. I'm really sorry.
Okay. All right. Sherry asks if you can address best processes for D&I initiatives.
No, I can't. Wait, okay. DEI or DNI?
Diversity and inclusion.
No. That's not an area that I'm expert in.
How do the strategies that you've talked about differ, if at all, when interacting with leaders outside of the organization, specifically board members?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, well, I'll point out two things. So boards are a weird place because they're in your organization, but most people, unless you're a senior executive, don't have access to the board typically. So if you do, uh, uh, so it becomes even more of an issue if you are able to present to the board or able to interact with board members. Like everything that we talked about is just like amplified even more because you have even less time with them. They have even more limited bandwidth than a typical senior leader, and you're less able to kind of get to know who they are or be known by them or know them. My recommendation would be to try to do as much research as possible. Talk to any senior leader that will talk to you to ask questions about, where's the board coming from? What are the dynamics on the board? Because a lot of people kind of perceive boards as being this monolithic thing, but they're often populated by, 12 or so very opinionated people who don't always get along and don't see eye to eye. So there's like a level of board politics going on that you probably have no idea about. And the better that you can kind of figure out what's really happening on the board and how they make decisions, why they make decisions, what their perspectives are, what are the power blocks within the board, I think that's really going to end up, helping you succeed and better craft your message.
Yeah, so true. I've worked with boards throughout my career, and you're right. It's a whole different world with its own politics. So, Annie would like to know, what's the distinction between being adaptable to organizational culture and being knowable?
Oh, wow. So that's a really great question. So, being adaptable to organizational culture. So again, it's really, for me, it's on this continuum of being your authentic self, but being your authentic self in this environment where you may recognize that people behave in a certain way. So it's really about kind of tailoring who you are to your organizational environment. And you may just have to turn the volume down on certain things and turn the volume up on other things. And this is almost a trite example, but like, I watch football. It's the only sport that I follow. And there are people, the senior leaders at the organization that I used to work with, who are like really big time football fans. Like really big time football fans, and had very, they had their team and they knew everything. And some of them were, had season tickets and the whole thing. And it's like, I paid special attention to, I was watching football anyway, but like when I would have interactions with those individuals, like I would make sure to know what the score of the Green Bay Packers game was that weekend. And I would make sure to know, what was happening with Aaron Rodgers or whatever. Right. So, and then there are aspects of myself, I'm a musician, and I like to write songs and play music. And I share that with some people who have that affinity, but that's like most people that I used to work with, like if I told them that, they'd be like, wow, we had no idea. So I think it's always going to be, when whatever organizational environment, and it's always going to be some curated version of yourself that you present. And I think it's really about, just like I said, kind of turning up the volume on some things and turning it down on others. But recognizing that within that organizational culture, people sort of think and interact in a certain way. And you want to be able to adapt your style to the way that they think and interact, and how things get done. Because I think for me, that's like what really is going to dictate success, is like, you've got to recognize, like, if things get done decisions get made in a certain way, to be able to understand that and adapt your style. Like for me, like I tend to work really well with people who are, I would say, emotional decision makers, we can get really excited about an idea and be like, oh my God, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be so much fun. But I've had to learn to adapt my style to connect with more analytical thinkers and certainly people who think more about kind of financial ramifications and the whole, like I said, that question of like, well, what's this going to cost? What are the details? Like, how are we going to figure this out? So again, that's not part of my natural style. That's not part of my natural kind of who I am and how I approach things. But like, that's something that I've had to kind of turn the volume up on that so that I'm ready to have that conversation after I've had the like, wow, this is exciting. This is going to be a really great program conversation.
Right. Well, speaking of style, James says, are there any style changes post-COVID? Having more digital relationship, text, email, conference call, social media, on camera. Have you seen COVID have an impact on the way we communicate with senior leaders?
Yeah, the two takeaways for me is that most organizations or most kind of relationships got like thrown into a holding pattern in COVID. So like you kind of still know the people that you knew before, but you're not developing new relationships because it's so much harder, because the like the soft work of work, the like meeting people after the meeting gets out, walking into the hallway and having that sidebar conversation, like that's not happening anymore. So we're in the meeting, you know, we're talking to people, but we're not developing as many personal connections, and we're not having as authentic a conversation, like I said, where we're like with the people that you trust, that you can walk out and just be like, oh my God, can you believe what just happened in there. The other thing is that people are more able, and I think this is true for if you consider yourself a millennial or Gen X or sorry, Gen Z or Gen Y, like people in that demographic tend to already be comfortable curating themselves on social media. So I don't know if I'm doing a great job or not. I usually do these programs in my office and sort of with a setup like Melissa with the bookshelf and the door. And I was like, okay, let me try this in my living room. So I moved into my living room. I set up some lighting. I'm by the window. You know, so with COVID and with kind of remote work, we can sort of curate conversations so much more. And I think the other thing to think about too is the skill of writing becomes so much more important, because I think email has become such, like, it was already oppressive before, but like even more of a key skill to be able to express yourself and be understood in email. And I've done programs that are just about like how to communicate effectively and get your message through. But the same idea applies that I was talking about before, is like you gotta if you write a paragraph, say it in a sentence and push that, if that a most important sentence, like get it up to the top, put it in the subject line if you can, right? So it's that writing skill that I think is that a lot of people really need to be able to improve on to be successful in this environment.
A few more. Marlene, who had the earlier question about infographics, asks if you have any recommendations on programs to use to design infographics.
I don't off the top of my head. There's one. Sorry. There's one that I used a while ago. It's a website that's specific for that, but I would have to dive into my emails and pull that up.
Maybe some of the other folks on the call could post something in the chat if they
share it in the chat if you're aware of that.
Okay. What's the best course of action, do you think, when you start work at a much larger company and take on a much bigger role as a leader within it?
I'd be humble and really understand the situation, you know, the culture and the people that you're working with before you try to do anything. So it's an interesting challenge. I've worked with a lot of leaders, and I've never known a senior leader to join a new organization and say, you know what, everything here looks pretty good. We're just going to keep it as is. We're going to keep doing what we've been doing. Nobody does that. Like, people come in and they want to put their fingerprint on things. But so I get that, and you should do that. But at the same time, before you start making changes, understand why things are the way they are, because there's always a reason. And that reason is often really non-intuitive as to kind of how it got to be that way. But, you know, build an understanding of the organization and get some allies on your side that you can bring along with you, and even sort of try out ideas on, to talk through and say, hey, you know what, I'm thinking about reorganizing my department because it doesn't make sense to have these people or whatever. Like, just say, you know, and then get their feedback on that and be like, oh, well, you gotta watch out because, but you know, there's something that you wouldn't even think of, they'll share with you, that if you just went ahead and like pulled the trigger on, it might blow up in your face.
All right, I think we have time for just one or two more questions. Here's an interesting one. How do you go about correcting your boss?
Oh,
Other than carefully.
Yeah. I'm curious, correcting on what? Like on a substantive matter, or like a personal style? Yeah.
I assumed it meant, you know, the boss is, you know, you're in a meeting, the boss has said something that's incorrect, factually incorrect.
Yeah.
You've got a program you're working on, and how do you go about addressing that?
For me, you know, I actually had this recently where I had to do that, and I said, I put it, I didn't identify their name, but I was like, yeah, we really dropped the ball on that one. So that I wasn't calling anybody out, but I was just like, you know, it had things gone differently, that I can't remember exactly how I phrased that, but to not put people on the spot. Like Nicole has it really, be as diplomatic as possible. You know, obviously, anytime you're communicating, and this is another topic, but anytime you're communicating something negative, don't do it in a public setting if at all possible. So, right, if you're in a meeting and your boss says, yeah, the deadline is next Tuesday, but it's the following Tuesday, then you gotta say something and just be like, oh, you know, for the record, I know there may be some confusion, but, you know, just be as diplomatic as possible. But if it's something that can wait, take it offline, just pull them aside and just say, I know you said this, but, you know, let everybody, and again, everyone wants this to sort of look good, save face, but it's even more so if you're the senior person and you're pontificating about something, and then somebody says, oh, by the way, you were totally wrong about that. That's not a good feeling. So avoid having anybody feel that way.
Okay. All right. We'll make this our last question from Erica. What are some ways to create connection when communicating via email? I'm in contact with community partners largely through email, and it often feels like blah and facts. How can I grow these connections?
So I was going to mention this at the very top when I was talking about just that rapport building. The two principles that I have are be interested and be interesting. So be interested in who they are and what they're doing and what's going on. And even in emails, you can have a fully factual email, and that is on topic and on point. And then at the end, just be like, oh yeah, I'm really curious to know what other initiatives you have. I'm really curious to know what's going on there, that like just come up with something where you're kind of probing to sort of understand them, and also share more to even in emails. Like I have clients that I work with that we communicate almost exclusively by email, but I'll include stuff about, I'm not going to be able to make that meeting next Tuesday. My brother's coming into town. We have a family golf, match that we play every time we get together. So it's like that. You wouldn't typically include that, but for me, it feels right when I'm for that client, for that person. So don't, like I said, be interested and be interesting. Like ask questions, but also share stuff about yourself and what's going on with you.
All right, fabulous. I think we could keep going on, but we won't. We will let things stop here. Folks, I will be sending out an email to everyone with a link to the presentation. So if you have questions for Gregor, I know he's just sharing his email here, and I will share that also in my follow-up email. So thank you for joining us today. We will be having another webinar next month, and I'll be sending you some information about that as well. I hope you all have a fabulous day.
Thanks, Melissa. And I will just say quickly, I don't know if people are still on the line, One of the things I miss about presenting in person is people kind of coming up and chit-chatting after the presentation. So my email's on the screen. Feel free to reach out, drop me a line, whatever. If you're curious about anything that I've said, have any other questions or want to explore anything further, I'd be thrilled to follow up with you. So thank you so much.